You're reminded daily that in this great democracy, you are but a relay swimmer in the currents of history, bound by decisions made by those who came before, reliant on the efforts of those who will follow to fully vindicate your vision. But the presidency also affords a unique opportunity to bend those currents by shaping our laws and by shaping our debates, by working within the confines of the world as it is, but also by reimagining the world as it should be. For history travels not only forwards, history can travel backwards. History can travel sideways. And securing the gains this country has made requires the vigilance of its citizens.
Please welcome former senior advisor to President Barack Obama, Valerie Jarrett, and co-host of Pod Save the People and Teach for America's Vice President of National Community Alliances, Brittany Packnett.
Hello, everybody. We can't see you, but we know you're there.
Hello again. I'm hoping that you've been having a good time. Is that right? Well, let the good times roll. I know this is going to be a fantastic conversation. It is an honor to be here with, I call her mentor mom, because she's a little bit of both. And I'm so privileged to be able to know you and to have a conversation about your brand new book, Finding My Voice. So excited about the stories that you've told and the advice that you're going to share with us today. And I told Valerie backstage, that's really the conversation that I want to have. There's so many experiences, so much wisdom that you have garnered in your incredible career, and we are trying to figure out what the path forward here is on this very difficult thing called race. So we're hoping you can give us some advice today.
I'll do my best.
You know, you have been a Black woman at the height of leadership in this country. You worked for the first Black mayor of Chicago and the first Black president of this country. And you worked in a presidential administration that was dealing with a lot of the real issues of race. So we're gonna get into all of that and then some. But I want to start at the very beginning, because I think what a lot of people don't know about your experience is that you grew up for a lot of your childhood actually not in the United States of America, but abroad. And I'd love to know what the experience of growing up Black and abroad helped to, how did it shape your understanding about race globally, and how did that translate once you came stateside?
Well, that was a big question. So let me go back to the beginning. So I was born in Shiraz, Iran. In 1956. Don't do the math now, do it later. And the reason we ended up there is that my father was a physician, and when he was leaving the Army, he wanted a job at a major academic institution to do the research he'd been doing in the Army, and he couldn't find a job anywhere in the country at an institution that he wanted to go to where his pay would be equivalent to his white counterparts. And so he and my mom began to explore alternatives outside of the United States, and they heard about a position helping to start a brand new hospital in the city of Shiraz, Iran, and my dad was asked to be the chairman of the Department of Pathology. And if you can just imagine, I don't think they'd been any further than Europe by that point in time. They didn't know anything about the government other than we had far better diplomatic relations than we do today. That they knew. That the public health department there was interested in having physicians from all over the world move and help start these new hospitals, share best practices back and forth. And they knew that he was getting a shot. And what happened there is that he stopped being a Black physician, or in that case, a Negro physician, and he became an American physician. And having grown up in thank you. Thank you very much. Having grown up in segregated Washington, D.C., my dad, and my mother segregated Chicago, both of them had faced the limitations of the color barrier and had surmounted them to some degree. I mean, my father was the first African-American to integrate Press St. Luke's Hospital in Chicago, for example. They wouldn't let him live in the dorm with the other residents. He had to commute 5 miles a day. And for any of you who know anything about residencies in when you were in medicine back in the day, and still in this day, he was at a real disadvantage. But they also told him he couldn't come in the front door. And he said, that's just a bridge too far. And so the first day of work, he walks through the front door, first day of work, and everybody's like, he came through the front door. And then the second day, when he showed up for work, all of the black orderlies and nurses and custodians were waiting by the front door for him. And it did teach him a lesson that you do have to persevere, but he hit a wall about getting a job. So the experience that I had growing up on a hospital compound with children from all over the world, we all spoke different languages, and so I learned French and English and Farsi and mixed them all up in the same sentence on a regular basis. But we found an expectation of being able to find something in common with people with whom we didn't think we necessarily shared a lot in common. And my father, I describe in the book, basically took me over the color barrier before I was born. And so I never appreciated what it was like to be a black American, either in terms of negative or positive. And one of the reasons why my parents moved back home was because my parents wanted me to understand what it was like to be an African American. And I kept going, well, I don't look like a black person, and I'm even fairer skinned than some of the Iranian people are, so I was very confused. And my father was offered a job because of the research he did in Iran at the University of College London, Galton Laboratories. And from there, the work he did caught the attention of the dean at the University of Chicago Medical Center, and he offered him a tenured track position, and then he went on to become the first African-American tenured at U of C, a job he would have never been able to get 6 years earlier. And so one of the really important life lessons he taught me is sometimes the shortest distance to where you want to go is the longest way around, but you have to have the courage to do that. You got to get out of your comfort zone, you got to do something radical at times, but then that's kind of where the magic is. So I was going through culture shock. Here I am, my parents are telling me I'm black, I don't look black. They put me in a public school in our neighborhood. The black kids were beating me up because I was fair-skinned. My younger cousin had to come defend me. That was embarrassing. She was like 10 pounds lighter and 6 months younger, and she could fight. She was a really good fighter. So
we all need that one cousin.
We do.
We all need that one cousin.
You know, I was 5, and they plopped me in 2nd grade because I had a really good education before that. And so I'm younger. I don't look like, and I'm from this country nobody's ever heard of. Oh, and I had a British accent. For that 1 year that I spent in Great Britain, I was an other in my mom's own community. And so that was very confusing for me. And then a few years later, I went to camp, and then I encountered my first bout of racism. It was an all-white camp except for me, and nobody knew I was black. And I didn't say it. I just want to get along and just slide on by. And I talked about how years later, I can't believe I didn't call this one little girl who was racist. And I just want to get out of there alive, not get beat up again.
Yeah.
And so I think it was very confusing for me as a young person, but my father came back to the United States a new man with a whole new level of confidence that he didn't have in his own country.
So you came back and experienced that kind of confusion, that othering that happens so many times, but you had multiple layers of being othered, right? How did you navigate your way back to yourself? How did you find your way to the confidence and the courage that we see before us today?
It was a long road. Let me tell you, I was painfully shy. I used to blush anytime I got called on in class. I remember in law school, my maiden name was Bowman, and it was a Socratic method, and they went in alphabetical order. So I got called on twice the first day of law school. I didn't think there would be a second day. I thought we were done. And I did not, and I think, I don't know, maybe it's because we moved around so much, I found it unsettling, and I didn't feel like I belonged anywhere. I did grow, obviously, very close with my mom's family, but still, I never talked about where I was born because, goodness knows, the first half of my life, well, not half, first third of my life, maybe, no one had heard of Iran, and then after that, nothing good came from mentioning it. I stopped speaking Farsi. I lost that British accent the first week of school. I just wanted to be like everybody else. And I think that that's part of the challenge is how do you find your own self and realize that your story is who you are. And when I first met Barack Obama, which is an interesting story in of itself, he asked me, where are you from? And I said, Chicago. And he said, did you grow up here? And I said, yes. And he said, were you born here? And I went, oh dear, here we go. And I said, no, I was born in Iran. And I expected like some banal comment. And he goes, well, that's interesting. You know, I lived in Indonesia. And we had this whole conversation about what it was like to be an other and to figure out your blackness when you didn't have the same background as so many other black people did. And we agreed on 3 things, which I found really informed the rest of my life when I thought about policies as well. Number one, we could walk into a room and feel comfortable with whoever's in the room, because we were used to being in a room with people who were very different than ourselves. And number two, that people who lived outside the United States maybe have a better appreciation for some of the civil liberties we have here. Clean water, clean food, didn't have to worry about diseases of the kinds that you find in underdeveloped countries. And the United States is the greatest country on earth, but it's not the only country on earth. And you can learn a great deal outside of the United States, right? But the answer about finding my voice is that I developed this 10-year plan when I came out of college. I don't know if any of you guys made 10-year plans.
I did.
Did you?
I'm not on the same 10-year plan that I planned, but yeah.
Well, good. Well, that's kind of my point, is that like, I was going to go right to law school, and I was going to figure out what I wanted to do, find my passion. I was going to get married and have a baby before 30, and I was going to live happily ever after. That was my plan. So I went right to law school. I went to one good firm. I found it a little boring. I'm sorry to the corporate lawyers in the room. And then I decided, oh, I'll go to a better firm. Maybe that'll be it. And then I married the boy next door. Literally, his mom grew up with my mom, same apartment building. Our fathers were friends. He was a doctor. My dad was a doctor. I had a crush on him since I was 8 and he was 12. He was an altar boy, and I used to just look at him in church. Telling you the truth.
Supposed to be focused on God, and you just.
I was a little distracted. It's a sign. And so, you know, what could go wrong? Well, everything went wrong. I did have my baby right on time. I was just shy of my 29th birthday. Best thing I ever did 33 years ago. But I looked up and I was miserable. And I thought, well, what am I going to do? This is not the life that was meant for me. I was not very good at anything, I felt. And a good friend said, why don't you think about public service? And you'll feel like you're a part of something bigger and more important than yourself. And Harold Washington, the first American mayor of Chicago, had just been reelected. Yeah. And I joined city government, and I think that's where I found my voice.
So let's go there. I love this idea that you found your voice in service of other people, right? That you recognize that it's actually not all about you and that there's something far bigger than you. But you had this fascinating trajectory of working for the first Black mayor of Chicago, and then you worked for a biracial, Black-appearing president named Barack Hussein Obama. And I'm wondering about the time in between, right? So you saw Chicago change in some real ways. You saw the country change in some real ways. When you think about race in that time in between, where did we start to get it more right? And where do you think we started to get it more wrong and actually things didn't change for the better?
Well, I think I've often said that if there hadn't been a Harold Washington, there might not have been a President Obama. Yeah. I think Harold gave us the impression that the impossible seems impossible until it's inevitable. And no one thought he could win, believe me. And then he did. And in fact, when I first met Barack Obama, I was so impressed with him. I thought, well, this is a fine young man. He just finished law school. He was engaged to Michelle Robinson. I was trying to hire her, and he was against it. So I was trying to convince him it was a good move to let her go and come and work with me in the mayor's office. He was not high on that at all. And I thought, you know what, maybe, just maybe one day, he could be mayor of Chicago. Because that was my ceiling, right? That was just my ceiling back then. I thought that was as good as it could possibly get. And so I think we did make some progress because we began to say, all right, well, if you can do that, maybe, you know, he can run for Senate, U.S. Senate, after he had a pretty easy walk into the state Senate and after he lost a congressional race. And I can remember at first I was hesitant about him doing that. And then he's like, well, if I'm not afraid, why are you afraid? Well, that was a good question. I shouldn't be afraid if he isn't afraid. Right. And he was fearless in that way. Well, maybe fearless isn't the right word. He was courageous. Which is not the absence of fear, it's overcoming fear. And he was prepared to take a risk. And I think that sense of momentum really carried people to a point where we were prepared to look at the issue of race in a way that our country hadn't really had to look at it. And that was progress. As I say in my book, I don't think we transcended race by any stretch of the imagination. You and I met under a very clear circumstance of in which we had not transcended race. But I think it was a step in the right direction. And I think all across the country, when Mayor Washington was elected, we were seeing the first African-American mayors being elected. They were moving into the state legislature. We were beginning to have more of a presence in office. And that was a good sign of progress. Not as much in business as I would like, but more in office. My law firm, there was maybe one other black person,
Really?
which is part of why I never felt at home.
Really, really. Talk a little bit more about that. So we're seeing progress on the representation of people of color in politics, right? Where are the places where we were stalling a bit and you felt like maybe, getting to the White House could help jump drive that?
Well, look, representation is one step in the right direction, but you need to have the people who are representing you actually in a position to affect change. And then you need culture to be a part of it too. We were talking backstage about this linkage between our culture and our laws and how you really have to have both moving in the same direction, and one leads sometimes and another one leads at other times. And I think that, frankly, we were not confronting some of the sub rosa indications of discrimination and racism in our country, and we were kind of painting them over with progress in the elected field. But it wasn't always translating into progress on the ground. I mean, Mayor Washington was a visionary, he had a progressive agenda. He did change Chicago in some fundamental ways, but it took 4 years for him to win the city council. And before that, he couldn't do anything, right? But he did, have set-asides and contracts and inclusion in terms of ensuring that professional services were going to people of color, businesses of color. And then it was impossible for his successor to reverse that. Yeah. So in some ways, the progress that we make, as long as our culture keeps up with it, you can't reverse. But in other ways, you can. And I think we've seen signs of that over the last 2 years.
Yeah, maybe a few signs, yes.
Regrettably.
Many signs.
Regrettably, and it shows you just how fragile progress is. That you can never rest and say, oh, okay, we're good here. And I think part of what concerns me, very honestly, is after the last presidential election, I kind of went through the stages of grief, sometimes all in one day. I was like, what happened here?
We all saw that picture after Election Day when you all were on the South Lawn. Have you all seen this picture? And some of the Obama staff were looking quite disappointed in the results.
Well,
That's an understatement.
What's stunning to me is I saw the cameras were on, and so I said, put on your good face. And so that was like as good as it could get at that moment. It's not like I got caught by surprise.
Yeah.
It was the best I could do. I'm just telling you the truth. I didn't see it coming. But where I concluded, because you can't, what if? But the one data point that I am deeply and profoundly troubled with is that 43% of eligible voters didn't vote. And that's not a democracy, and we cannot ensure that our elected representatives take us seriously and follow what's in our best interest unless we hold them accountable. And if we don't vote, I assure you the special interests who care about the status quo, they will be right there. Or those who want to reverse the status quo, has been the case in the last couple of years. And so figuring out ways going forward where I can focus on trying to get people to vote and be good citizens and appreciate the power of every single one of us to be a force for good. And I think sometimes people, particularly young people, not Brittany, but young people her age, think, well, there's nothing I can do. Or I'm going to just shun all institutions because I look at it and none of them are really speaking to me. Well, go find somebody who is speaking to you and talk them into running for office. And realize that democracies are led by elected representatives. And so you can't just opt out.
Yeah. So let's talk about this moment that you all decided to opt in, right? So hashtag Team Obama is assembled. It is, we're running our way up to the 2008 presidential election. This is during the primary season. And suddenly these videotapes start to come out of one Reverend Jeremiah Wright. We remember this, right?
I surely do.
You could never forget.
Seared in my memory.
And so it got to the point where, because Reverend Jeremiah Wright had engaged in what we know to be the very prophetic tradition of black preaching and the black church to call out America's flaws, suddenly you all had to answer for then Senator Barack Obama's association with Reverend Wright. Can you bring us back to that time and tell us the story of how you helped him kind of see his way through to how he was going to speak to the American people about race?
It boils down to this, and it is hard to remember just how excruciating it was at the time, but we consider this to be an existential threat to his campaign, and not just his campaign, but everything the campaign stood for, that we should be looking for what we have in common and focusing on not our differences and looking for ways of unifying our country. And those tapes were far from that. And his thought was this, is that I owe the American people an explanation. I can't just tell them, trust me on this. I have to explain it to them and give them context. And so, but it was interesting because he had a campaign full of people who were all working 24/7 to elect the first black president. But we found even within the senior staff that the white advisors were having a hard time imagining what he could possibly say that would be satisfying. And the two black advisors were like, no, you can explain this because it can be made to make sense because it's our life experience as well. And
you all recognize that Reverend Wright was speaking to a particular pain.
Yes, and that and validating that pain theatrically by overstatement in some degree as a way of getting people to say, yes, I see where you're coming from in a way. And he just really wanted to be able to tell that story. And he wrote that speech like overnight because it was all from the heart. And it did put it in context. And I think people understood him a little bit better and he felt he owed them an explanation. And I think part of what we need are people who have some humility, who are running for office and recognize every single day they have to earn your trust.
That's right, that's right. And in that passage, you, shout out to humility. In that passage, you talk about the fact that you recognized that in that moment, that not only was that speech, but really the purpose of this presidency was about, and I quote, not to transcend race, but to reckon with it. How have we been reckoning with it? How have we been doing?
Well, it's a mess. And maybe a mess is what we need. I mean, I'll give you a good example. I read a study a few years ago, right after Trayvon Martin and then obviously Michael Brown, near and dear to your heart, and Tamir Rice and Eric Gardner, and you know, the list goes on. And by not mentioning them, I'm not in any way diminishing them because each and every one is excruciating. And I had people come up to me and say, what's happening in our country? Black men are being shot by police. Black people weren't surprised. They just weren't. I remember that when I was a young person, I mentioned this story in my book, my mom and I were driving in our neighborhood, and two black teenagers who lived a block from us were pulled over by the police. And my mom stops the car, and I'm like, what are you gonna do? And she said, I have to go say something. And I said, why? And she said, because I don't know what will happen to them if I don't. And she went over and said, look, I know them, officer, and I don't know it's whether she looked white or whether she scared the officers like she scared me, I don't know. With my mother, it's hard to say, but they let them go. Yeah. But my point in saying this is I had a white colleague in the White House come into me in the midst of Michael Brown, and he said, what's this talk you guys have? Now here he is, progressive, working for the first black president, had worked for another black elected official, and he said, I don't know what this is. And I said, every family, black family that has a son, has a talk with the son to explain to them how they have to behave if they interact with the police. Not that all police will treat them this way, but you can't take a chance with your life. And that if they're with their white friends can have a lot more latitude in terms of talking back than they have. And he said, why don't I know this? And I said, because it's embarrassing to talk about. And so why would we ever talk about the fact that we have to raise our sons differently? The fact that that's now out in the open, the fact that you participated on the president's task force for 21st century policing, basically pulled the rug off of what had been going on all along. These video cameras just showed the facts. It's not that it got worse. It's just that we captured it. That's progress.
But it's progress, but it's challenging, right? To be confronted with your greatest challenges, to be confronted with things, and then to realize that you are in some ways culpable in helping to perpetuate these things is difficult to swallow. So once you're confronted with it, what's the next step?
Well, you have to really listen to yourself and you have to say, okay, now what am I gonna do about this? And I think that's up to all of us. Like, what do we wanna do in our own life to try to improve upon this? Because Look, we can change the laws. I was here for the 50th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act, of the library, actually, and we celebrated the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act and everything that President Johnson did to move that arc of the moral universe towards justice. But we have to also recognize that, again, how fragile that progress is, and that you might take 2 steps forward, and then just as President Obama said in the introductory video, you might take a few steps back. Yeah. And the fact that we're in the midst of a particularly challenging time, because I think what was helpful over our 8 years, at least the tone at the top, was one that was trying to appeal to our better selves and trying to say, look, we have more in common than we have differences. And that hasn't been the case now. And so now we're trying to work on the ground and have it bubble up. And that's actually where the sustainable change comes from.
Let's talk a little bit about that, because when we first met, as you said, it was in the middle of the Ferguson. It was actually toward the beginning of the Ferguson uprising, because that actually lasted 400 days. The president had called on a handful of young activists from around the country to come. 4 of us were from Ferguson. And when I tell you all, we prepared for this meeting to ensure that we were not overwhelmed by the awe of the occasion. Right?
Because it is a very cool office. You brought them into the Oval Office.
You're like, this wall is round. We're really going here. And the president opens up the door, and he's so comfortable, and, he dapped us all up, because that happened. And, but we had prepared ourselves to make sure that we were having an earnest and honest conversation. So we were very serious, we were very prepared. We knew that there were gonna be hard truths that we had to say in that room. But I will tell you, in the lobby, before we went into the office, Valerie comes out and she says, "Oh, hi, I'm Valerie." And I'm like, oh my gosh, it's Valerie Jarrett. And all I could think to say was, "You were so good on The Good Wife last week."
Which meant a lot to me. That really was like the highest
I'm glad
compliment.
It meant a lot to you, because it was very embarrassing for me. I was prepared to have this very honest conversation, but I could not get over my fangirling of Valerie Jarrett. But what ensued in the next few months, really, was that reckoning with race, was recognizing that you were part of an administration that had made history, and still that did not make this administration or this era in history exempt from racial tension and racial oppression, right? We saw Charleston, we saw Trayvon Martin, and the speech that the president made after that, certainly Michael Brown Jr. Tell me what it meant and how we should be setting expectations of elected officials to deal with these times, even when we know there has been progress made.
Well, I think it's incumbent upon the elected officials to help people, to make it teaching moments, to help people understand. When President Obama spoke after Trayvon Martin's death, and he said, if I had a son, he'd look like Trayvon Martin, he humanized not just Trayvon Martin, but every black boy who's just trying to get home safely. And when people could say, oh, that could happen to the President of the United States' son, it challenged us in a way with a humanity to it that I think is a part of what leaders should do. I remember so well the speech he gave in Charleston after Reverend Pinckney and his 8 parishioners were murdered. And President Obama was so struggling with, how do I go to yet another memorial service for a mass shooting in this country and feel like, what's left to say here? I've been to Sandy Hook, I've been to Fort Hood, I've been more places than anyone should have to be, and we still can't get Congress to take even the most sensible steps to keep guns out of the wrong hands. And he was very, very frustrated. And we started having a conversation prompted by the families who went to court soon after the tragedy, like within a day or two, for the arraignment of the young person who committed this atrocity after having sat for an hour in a Bible study. This wasn't some drive-by random act of violence. He met with the people and he told one of the women, I want you to see this so you live to tell about it. How do you get that level of hatred at age 21? And so we were talking about that, and then when the family said, we forgive him, that's what got President Obama thinking, well, maybe there's a little bit more I need to say about the black church. And how does a black church leave its door open when it has a history of bombings and devastation?
Which we're dealing with right now.
Exactly, exactly. Why do they welcome a stranger? And yes, it's important to take down the Confederate flag, and good for Nikki Haley, who led that charge, and it was a courageous thing she did in that state to do that.
Shout out to Bree Newsom, who took it down first.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. But is that enough, or should we be figuring out why the schools are crumbling in that state? Should we be figuring out how to improve the relationship between the police? Should we be thinking, how do we find what we have in common and make that the fabric of our country that is its backbone and its strength? And I think what is incumbent upon leaders, and President Obama was really good at this, is lifting above the tragedy of the moment and trying to turn it into a path forward. Recognizing that the journey is long. We were talking backstage about how particularly, within this era of instant gratification, anything, I used to have to go to the library and look things up on index cards. Like half of you probably don't even know what I'm talking about there.
Shout out to the Dewey Decimal System, everyone.
Right? But you have everything you want right here, and you think it's going to happen overnight. And I mentioned in my book that President Obama gave me one year for my birthday a copy of the Petition for Universal Suffrage, framed next to the resolution of Congress when they passed women's right to vote. It was 50 years. And many of the women who were engaging in starvation strikes and demonstrations and being imprisoned and being vilified by their spouses didn't live to see the progress. And that's how hard it is and how long it takes. And I think part of what we need to do in this era is we have to adjust our idea of what is success and recognize it's incremental. And it builds upon itself if we keep pushing. And if we don't keep pushing, it will slip back. And there are inevitably zigzags along the way. But when something really bold happens, it does feel like a thunderbolt until you remember all of the decades that it took to get you there. We were having this conversation in the context of same-sex marriage. When President Obama took office, it was legal in 2 states. 2 states. 6 years later, it was 37 states, meaning each state house had taken action, and the District of Columbia. And that's where the Supreme Court ruled. So it did move dramatically during our time, but the groundwork happened decades. It was decades in the making. And so I try to say that to put this moment of chaos in context and to recognize that if we're not going to have leadership pulling us together at the top, then it is more incumbent than ever on each of us individually to accept responsibility for that on the ground.
That is absolutely sage advice.
She just said that was sage advice. She said that to me earlier, and I said that sounds like advice from old people.
It's wisdom that we all need right now, especially as we look at the election cycles ahead. So I want to transition us to talk about the immediate future in 2020. I'm not going to ask you who your candidate is because I already know what the answer to that is. You're going to say, we're still looking to see this, so I won't put you on the spot.
An embarrassment of riches is what I'd say.
That's a good answer. But here we are in this moment where, in 2008, we had one person of color, one man of color, and one woman. And now, lo and behold, we've got more people of color, we've got more women, we've got, gasp, women of color, actually running for the highest office in this land. But we keep having this conversation that is separating 2 things that I wonder if you think are mutually exclusive, and I'd love for you to talk about this a little bit. We keep talking about the importance of beating the guy in the office right now. I won't name him, but the guy in office right now. We keep talking about...
That's really important.
Electability, right? We talked about, it's really important. We talk about making sure that we don't have to suffer through this administration, but we talk about that separately from actually ensuring that perhaps a person of color, a woman of color, and someone with truly progressive ideals can also occupy that office. We treat them like they're 2 mutually exclusive ideas. Do those have to be mutually exclusive?
No, not at all. I don't think that we're at a point where we're prepared to say that a woman or a person of color can't win because of this era we're in. I'm not prepared to give up on that as a notion. Nor am I prepared to mandate that be the next president. I'm interested in who is the person who is going to advocate for what's best for our country, that creates a level playing field where every young child can compete and achieve their dreams? Who's going to be looking out for the people who are not being looked after right now? And who's going to send the message to the world that we are the greatest democracy on earth, and that we are, for example, a nation of laws and a nation of immigrants? That's been our history. So that's the kind of vision I'm looking for in who moves our country forward. Now, and to your prediction of what I would say, I think it's too early, for me at least, to answer that question. That doesn't mean that you all shouldn't. You should each figure out in your own mind who you want to get behind. But the advice that I have given to the candidates with whom I have met is really twofold. Number one, I think the country is going to be more interested in your affirmative action, affirmative message for what you're going to do, authentic voice about what you're going to do, and why we should trust that you have the ability to execute it. That's step number one. And then the other thing is, and it's related to it, which is don't beat your opponents in the primary up so badly that they are weakened going into the general election.
Amen. Amen.
And I think they fit together. I think they fit together. I think ultimately the authenticity and the forward look of what you want to do is a more powerful message than stripping down your other colleagues in the Democratic Party.
And that sounds like it applies to us too, because we're out here beating up other folks who might like a candidate that we don't like, and suddenly we won't actually have the opportunity and the wherewithal to be unified when the time comes.
We have to give ourselves space to unify. And so we cannot become so angry and so willing to attack or let perfect be the enemy of the good. Look, good would be really good right now, right?
Yes. Yes, indeed.
I'm just saying.
Yes, indeed. So we only have a few minutes left. I want to ask you two last questions. One, we talked earlier when I was on stage about what can often feel like intergenerational conflict, that we have a generation of more experienced and wise folks, and we've got a generation of young and imaginative folks, and sometimes they are really butting heads. But I have experienced you to be someone who takes seriously the idea that you can continue to move forward in your work while also bringing a younger generation, while also training us, developing us, supporting us in the work that we're doing. So why is that so important to you? And what advice do you have for folks about actually making that happen?
Well, I think my advice comes from how I felt I was treated when I was a young, single, working mom. And, some of my pain was self-inflicted. Like, I was superhuman, and I was going to take care of my daughter, and I was going to be, before I got divorced, a perfect wife, and I was going to be a high-powered lawyer, and I was never going to ask for any help, and I'm dropping balls all over the place, and I'm pretending to myself and to my friends and family that I've got this, right? I've got it all together. And that was just a huge, huge mistake. And then as I grew older and I was in a position to be a manager, or in the White House certainly, I started to remember how it was for me in those early days. And I had everything going for me. I had means, I had stable, wonderful childcare. I had parents who lived in my neighborhood. My dad took my daughter to school every day and picked her up every single day. I never had to worry about that safety net that so many working families have to worry about. And so those days I used to think about, well, what about the people who are working a second shift and have no idea how they're going to make ends meet? Who's rooting for them? And who's fighting for them? And so I wanted to be that person. And when I was the chair of the White House Council on Women and Girls, I really focused on gender equity and focusing also particularly on women and girls of color who are more vulnerable than most. And by example, I wanted to be a mentor to the next generation that I did have when I joined city government. So I didn't have a mentor when I was at the law firm, but I had an amazing Black woman who was my client when I was a lawyer for the city. And she took me under her wing and she changed my life. And she taught me not just how to advocate for the people of Chicago and feel fierce about representing those whose voices were not as loud as ours could be, but she also taught me how to advocate for myself. And she convinced me to ask for promotion. I would no more have asked for a promotion on my own. Not only a promotion, she talked me into asking for a double promotion.
Yes, I like this.
My attitude is when my boss thinks I'm worthy, he'll give me one step at a time. And she's like, that's ridiculous. He's not thinking about you. And she pushed me and she pushed me and she pushed me. And lo and behold, I finally thought, well, let me get this over with because she'll just not forgive me until I do. And I got it. And, you know, maybe I wouldn't have gotten it. And she said, if you don't get it, then that's okay. You'll go back in 6 months and ask for it again. My point being, and I would have. And then fast forward, 4 weeks ago, I called her to tell her she's in the book because she was such a powerful figure in my life and I didn't want to be surprised. And I also told her that I had showed the book to Mrs. Obama's chief of staff. And she read it and said, you know what? I enjoyed your book, but that one story about the promotion didn't make any sense. She said it was so easy. You just walked in there and you got it. So I said to Lucille, this is 30 years later, I said, did you say anything to my boss? And she said, I might have. All this time, I thought I went in there and I got that promotion on my own. But the obvious lesson in this is, you know, don't think you're all that. But secondly, that like I had established enough of a relationship with her that she was vested in my success. And not just to pull me aside and tell me what to do, but to go to bat for me when I wasn't in the room. And so I have felt this enormous responsibility to do for other young people what she did for me. And I know how hard it is to be, you know, you're out there, and even any of the working families, look, life is just hard. And I used to think, well, if I were smarter, if I were more efficient, if I were more organized, if I slept fewer hours, maybe it wouldn't be so hard. No, it's just hard. And you need people in your life who are going to try to make it a little bit easier for you. And I get great pleasure. I'm so unbelievably proud of this young woman, having met you just, yeah, see? Every time I see her out and about or on social media, I go, that's my girl. I remember when she was walking in the Oval Office, looking up at the ceiling, but a message, and willing to take a chance and be a part of really important work that we were doing that you needed to have courage to do, because it's hard when you come inside. I used to tease the people who protested outside of the White House, and I would say, you know, the door is open. Like, you could just come on. I'd talk to you. I'd talk to anybody. And you weren't afraid to come in. And for that, I appreciate you.
I appreciate you. I'll give you your $20 for that later. So here's my last question. Your life has taken so many unexpected turns. And when I was reading your book and seeing all of the ways in which life had moved unexpectedly for you, I honestly thought about our country and all of the ways in which we have swerved and moved and gone up and down and front and back and didn't always see it coming. And so what is your advice to us as we step out there and try to do the work, knowing full well that we can't always see what's coming, but we have to stay in the fight anyway?
Well, I think simply put, when I was young, I didn't have the courage or self-confidence to swerve. And when I finally realized that straight course that I had chosen for myself, that made-up dream that I'd had when I was far younger, in my comfort zone, wasn't making me happy, I was so unhappy, it forced me to get outside of the comfort zone. I often think, well, what if I hadn't been as unhappy? Might I have stayed at that law firm forever? Let's hope not. But when I got outside of that comfort zone, when I swerved into city government, that's when the adventure began. And so if we can have the courage to appreciate our own resilience, because that's what you're really afraid of. You're afraid, well, if I try, I might fail. Or if I try, I might get a setback even further. And when we realize, yeah, okay, yeah, you could stumble and fall. In fact, we all do, or we're not sufficiently outside of our comfort zone. And you learn from it, and you survive, and you get back up. I used to be so painfully afraid of public speaking, and now I make my living speaking. It's ridiculous when I think about how I was 30 years ago. But it can happen, and so I want people to just try to appreciate the magic of the zigzag. And as our country zigs and zags, the question is, what are we going to do? Yeah. What are we going to do to push hard in the direction that we think it should go? And don't give up our power. It is what we have, and it is within our control to exercise it, and we just have to find out how to do it. And it doesn't have to be the same When I think about what I thought about my life when I, say, began in city government, no, I would have never predicted I would be sitting here with you today at this extraordinary library. But when I look back, the chapters added up to a book, literally to a book. But at the time, it was just like a terrifying abyss that you're jumping into. Jump into that abyss.
All right, let's jump into the abyss. Valerie Jarrett, everyone.